Good morning. Welcome once again to World Affairs. Today we are going to get serious. Uh, According to my new best friend, ChatGPT, there are about 5 countries playing around in Syria, and there is a myriad of, let's call them militias, killing each other. Um, Quite a place. As Yakov Smirnov, who was a regular on the Ed Sullivan Show, used to say about his home country, what a country. I think we can say that about Syria. Our guest today, the guest speaker today, Jeff Jones, is going to straighten this all out for us, I'm sure. Jeff is a history professor at UNC Greensboro, and impressively, he is the director of undergraduate education there. So without more, Jeff, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Robert, and thank you all for being here this morning. And indeed, yes, what a country. A very complicated country, to put it mildly. I don't know if I can make sense of it or not. I may even further complicate matters a little bit here, but I'm going to try. I want to basically trace some of the background of Syrian history, including way back to some extent, but mostly focus on the recent decades in recent history, the Civil War certainly, and then end up with a bit of what's going on there now, which is a lot going on there now. Of course, starting with geography, I always like to start with geography. Syria is an ancient country, as I'm sure you know. It's right in the middle, it's in the heart of the Middle East. It is, of course, its capital down here in Damascus, one of the other major cities up in the north, Aleppo. Those two cities, by the way, are two of the world's longest continuously inhabited cities. So this place goes way back, right? And you can see, just while we've got the map up here, the neighborhood. It's an interesting neighborhood. It borders Lebanon down here. It shares a lot in common with Lebanon, in fact. There's a very contentious border down here with Israel, highly militarized. That's the Golan Heights, especially that forms that border with Israel down here, seized by Israel and still occupied in the 1967 Six-Day War. Shares a very long border here with Jordan and Iraq, and most of which, from like roughly this area on, is very sparsely inhabited in the midst of the Syrian desert, so not a lot going on necessarily there. And then it shares up to the north, of course, really long border with Iraq there. In the north, a sort of hilly, mountainous border with Turkey as well. The population of Syria, by the way, today is estimated at about 23.5 million. It is, in so many ways, also just a very divided population. Actually, before I get to that, I want the population density, as I pointed out there. The desert, as you would expect, is rather sparsely inhabited, but most of the population, not surprisingly, focused mostly on the western areas here, Damascus, and the cities, of course, and up in the north. So a large swath of it is relatively sparsely inhabited. And one thing certainly about Syria is just its location, right? Again, it's an ancient city in the heart of the Middle East, and as such, it's been a crossroads for millennia, right? This goes way, way back, crossroads of trade, communication, and cultural interaction. And one consequence of that history, a key legacy of that history, is it's a very mixed population. I mean, one of the things, again, about this, not just Syria, but this whole area, is because of this history of different peoples and different empires, there's a lot of religious minorities and to some extent ethnic minorities as well, and that often adds up to a very contentious and complicated history in most parts of the world where that has been the case. Specifically here, this is a sort of ethnic breakdown from a 2014 map that's more or less the same. I'm not going to go through all these different groups, but I just wanted to highlight with this just how, many different groups there are, right? Including and especially here the majority being what we see here in orange, Sunni Muslim majority there. A very crucial group, though, is in red, spills over into, on this map it's in red, the Alawite Shia Muslim minority spills over into Turkey. There's also an Alawite, not shown on the map necessarily, but there's also an Alawite presence in down in Lebanon. Well, actually, it is a little bit on the map. But all these other different, there's a significant Christian minority. Of course, Syria was in the heart of the Byzantine Christian Empire at one time. And that's one of the things that Syria, again, being at this crossroads, its history has been defined by one empire after another. Right? It was, in fact, it was the site of the Assyrian Empire, going back way, way, way back, and then the Roman Empire, and then at some point the Byzantine Empire. Ultimately, though, that gives way, of course, to in the early modern period, to Ottoman Turkish rule. Beginning in the 16th century, that's going to last, of course, up until the end of World War I. And that's a defining factor, and it leaves one heck of a legacy, shall we say, in part for a couple of reasons. One being the common Ottoman practice of ruling through its vast empire was ruled through mostly local Sunni Muslim groups. And that has had a lasting impact, certainly in Syria, and they did so often at the expense of, and even for the most part, the Ottoman Empire was remarkably tolerant of religious minorities. But in the case of Syria, they did tend to repress, once again, I'll come back to this Alawite minority, and in some cases, some of the other Shia-leaning minorities as well. They were pressured in some cases to try to get them to convert to Sunni Islam. Some did so, but not very successfully. Most remained Alawites. In fact, with this map, I'm going to kind of toggle back and forth here between this map and the chart because it gives you a little different perspective of the same thing. This one just giving you a breakdown. Again, Arab Sunni, roughly 60-ish% are majority. Then you have the Arab Alawite, who are, again, I'll reiterate, Shia Muslim, or one of the minority groups here listed at about 12%. There are other Shia minorities, including the Druze and the Ismaili. Those are considered sects of Shiism as well. And I'm highlighting this Sunni-Shia divide because we're going to come back to it in the current context. It's a very, very crucial part, not only of Syrian history, but of the current situation. This divide between the Sunni majority and the Shia minority is very important. And again, as noted, lest we shall forget, there is a significant Christian between the mostly Armenian, but also Greek Orthodox, going back to the Byzantine presence in the area, a significant minority there. And I also wanted to highlight, in part because I've always sympathized with the Kurdish minority. They always get the wrong end of the stick, I'm afraid. There is a significant Kurdish minority in Syria, 10-ish, 9-10% or so. And that's Arab. The Arab, of course, majority Arabic is a linguistic designation, as you know. Arabic is the majority language and sort of ethnicity of this region and of the country. Kurds are speak a Persian-related, or Farsi, the language of Iran. And why I say I've sort of historically sympathized with them is because they've sort of gotten a raw deal. But I'll come back to that actually and elaborate a little bit. But first of all, the Alawites. And I'm focusing on the Alawites, as you may already know. I'm not sure how much knowledge I'll have coming in. The Assad family were Alawites. And so even though they're a minority of about, 12, some say I've seen as high as 15%, the Alawites have, until quite recently, ruled Syria for about 50 years. So they've played a kind of disproportionate role in that regard. And we see here again sort of areas in which they are the majority and areas in which they are a significant minority. It goes up into Turkey, spills up. And it's most of that coastal region, a mountainous coastal region of Syria. And it spills down into Lebanon somewhat as well. I like maps, by the way. I should have warned you. I got lots of maps, right? And this one is a bit dated, but more or less shows the same breakdown of the ethnic. And of course, maps like this, I will say, are kind of distorting in their very nature, because you look at this map and you think, well, only Kurds live up here or over here, and only Sunni Muslims. And of course, that's not true. There are pockets of people spread out throughout. But what the map is at least giving us is a little bit of a breakdown of geographically where the majority groups reside, where the majorities predominate, right? So not the most accurate in that regard. But again, I want to come back to the Kurdish minority on this map in the kind of pinkish, I guess you'd call that pink, up in the top. They spill over into Turkey, and in fact, the Kurds have had such a rough history, right? And always getting the wrong end of the deal here. They are, as you can see here, this again showing the darker green, of course, areas where they particularly predominate, and you can see that they're across all these borders, right? And mostly into southwestern Turkey. Southeastern Turkey, and down across into Iran and Iraq, and also a bit in Syria. They're less represented in Syria than in some of the other places, even up into the former, you can tell it's an older map, it still has USSR on it, even up into Azerbaijan, specifically now the independent country of Azerbaijan. The Kurds are the single largest ethnic group that live in one contiguous area geographically that do not have their own state. Now, why is that? That's a long and complicated history in its own right that I won't go into, other than to say it has to do with the British, of course. The British promised them their own state back during World War I if they would support their war effort in World War I. And the Kurds did support their war effort, but the British didn't hold up their end of the deal. After the war, they did not create a Turkish state. And the Kurds have fought sort of off and on, mostly on, against mainly Turkey since the early 70s in an effort to create their own state. They were kind of, one result of the first Gulf War is that this northern part of Iraq has become, in effect, a de facto Kurdish state. Not nationally recognized or internationally recognized, but they have a great deal of autonomy there. But they are, I will also add, other than Israel, the Kurds are the single largest U.S. ally in this area, by far. And they played a pivotal role militarily in the conflict against ISIS and the ouster of ISIS. So the Kurds, unfortunately, have gotten a bit of a historical raw deal to date, but they have played a very, very, very pivotal role. Now, as far as the history here, I want to jump to the early 20th century, as noted. Collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. So the Ottomans, as a result, are no longer ruling this vast terrain as they had up until that point. And it then shifts to French or British rule. In the case of Syria, French rule. They create the League of Nations at the end of World War I, creates what they called mandates. France was granted a mandate to rule Syria and Lebanon. Britain is granted a mandate to rule Iraq, which, by the way, hadn't even previously existed. They kind of cobbled that together out of 3 provinces of the Ottoman Empire and create Iraq. Transjordan, as it was called back then, of course, we know it as Jordan. Oh, and yes, I do have a map. I have a map for that. Rather than an app, I have a map. That's the wrong map. I went the wrong direction there, sorry. It helps if you use the right map. Mandate, just to clarify, just a tidbit on this, it wasn't really a colony in the traditional sense. Because for one thing, by the early 20th century, colonialism was getting kind of a bad connotation to it. And certainly it was not colonial in the sense of, say, British rule of Kenya or French rule of Southeast Asia, where, just to take 2 examples, they have a much more profound economic impact and things like that. The mission of the mandates that are handed out at the end of World War I is for the European powers to kind of oversee a gradual transition to self-rule. And again, just to point out and reiterate, the French get a mandate over Syria, and these were indefinite. There was not any kind of time frame put on the period of the mandate, and they would wind up varying significantly. Syria and Lebanon are French mandates. Palestine at the time, of course, Israel, Transjordan, now Jordan, and Iraq, created out of these other 3 provinces. So that's early 20th century, and the French obviously going to play a pivotal role. One of the factors that happens here with the French, as soon as this is announced, that the French are going to have a mandate rule over Syria, there's emergence of Syrian opposition, armed opposition. Syrians are not happy about this, as you would expect, right? They see it as, well, now the Ottoman Empire is done and we're going to finally be independent. So for them it was a disappointment, and many of these Syrian groups rise up in opposition, including the Alawites. And the Alawites, in fact, have a brief armed opposition against French rule at the beginning of the 20s and the early Mandate period, which is defeated by the French, of course, overwhelming military power. And that's a key little detail here, because the French it's like the old, I'd say carrot and stick, but it's kind of reverse. It's stick and carrot. Because they crush the rebellion, the uprising, and then they reward the Alawites. They kind of lure them, if you will, and say, well, if you'll help us rule on behalf of the French colonial administration against the rest of the population, we'll benefit you in certain economic ways. And especially, they reward the Alawites with positions within the French colonial military apparatus. And that becomes very important, because what it means over time is the Alawites gain a sort of vested interest in the military, within the military structure of that time of the French colonial empire, but that's going to carry on as well. The French, like the British, were particularly masters of the old divide and rule, right? And the French, they were not bad at it either. So again, just with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, I keep going. I think I'm hitting the wrong side on this, right? To counteract the Sunni dominance, as again a sort of a divide and rule kind of strategy here, the French are encouraging the Alawite minority, other minorities as well, but particularly the Alawites, to kind of help them out, and this gives them over time an influence disproportionate to their relative numbers, as well as, by the way, the Alawites in the early 20th century and right into the decades to come were a relatively impoverished part of the Syrian population. They lived in that coastal mountain region. They were mostly agriculturalists, of course, and they survived, they subsisted, but they were definitely not a wealthy segment. In fact, they were one of the less wealthy segments of Syrian society for much of this period. So some of this is an economic reward to their benefit as well. So to fast forward then, Syria does gain its independence from the French Mandate shortly after World War II. In 1946 in April, but almost from the get-go it proves to be a very unstable government. There's a series of coups d'etats in the 1950s. It becomes one of those governments of constant governmental coups d'etats and overthrows. Interesting little development, kind of an aside, but it's a interesting detail. At least in 1958, Syria joins with Egypt, at the time ruled by, you've probably heard or remember, Gamal Abdel Nasser, right? Whose main philosophy was one of pan-Arabic unity. All Arabs should unite, and that way we'll be able to keep the foreign imperialists at bay. So in part of that philosophy, the Syrians agreed to join Egypt in what they called the United Arab Republic in 1958. Proves to be very short-lived for a whole lot of complicated reasons. The main reason, simply put, though, was that in this United Arab Republic, it became very clear very early on that Egypt was kind of going to be the dominant partner. And not just Egypt, but specifically Nasser, which the Syrians are like, well, we didn't sign on to this. So in 1961, there's another coup d'etat, yet another coup d'etat in Syria, another overthrow of the government that then leads to the dissolution, the end of this short-lived 58 to 61 United Arab Republic. Just opens the way, though, to more political instability. There's another coup d'etat in 1963, which turns out to be a crucial turning point, because that's the coup d'etat where the Ba'ath Party, the Syrian Ba'ath Party, takes power. And the Ba'ath Party, just to highlight, that's the party that was just ousted. So they've been in there a while, to put it mildly, since 1963. And they are, at the time, certainly less so in the post-Cold War era, but they were sort of mildly, loosely socialistic in their leaning. And they were definitely Arab nationalists, and they were very secularist. And I think that's an important distinction because of the way things have gone since then. Now, it's a little less secular these days. Over time, that's going to become less prominent. So the fact that it was the Baathists, with all their many problems, for one thing, they were adamantly pro-Soviet during the Cold War, but they were secularist. And that's an important distinction. This fella specifically, this of course being Hafez al-Assad, he was an Air Force general within that. He was part of that 1963 coup that took power as a part of the Ba'ath Party in 63. He becomes defense minister. In fact, he's defense minister during the 1967 Six-Day War when Syria fared as did pretty much all of the combatant states against Israel. Israel won that in 6 days, redefined the map of the region, and in fact seized Golan Heights. That's the 67 Six-Day War. That was while Hafez Assad was defense minister. But he weathered the storm, and not only does he weather the storm, he manages to seize power himself in yet another coup in 1970, at which point now he is the leader of Syria's Ba'ath Party. And also what's interesting about that, or significant about that, for one thing, he's part of that Alawite minority, as noted. So now the Alawites are actually in power. And that was, at the time, it's 1970, the Syrian constitution stipulated that the president could only be a Sunni Muslim. So he kind of had to change that. And he did. He changed the Constitution to amend that stipulation, and he ruled the country for the next 30 years until his death in 2000. But in between, a lot happened in between. I mean, I guess you would say the plus side of this, he brought stability, no doubt about that. There were no more coups d'etats, right? And that's right up until the recent overthrow in December of last year. The Assads are going to rule from 1970 up until 1924, or 2024, excuse me. So a very long period. So he brought relative stability, certainly. He's very much on the Soviet side of the Cold War. But again, I would say certainly this factors into the positive category. He was secularist, despite many other faults. At least he wasn't Islamic extremist, right? Which is a whole different kind of issue, to put it mildly. And they forge a socialistic-ish state, I would call it, with a family dynasty, and it's one that certainly favors the Alawite minority. There was a question there? No. I'm sorry, I thought I saw your hand. No. Sorry about that. But yeah, it's very much on the Soviet side of the Cold War. In fact, the Russians, the Soviets, still to this day, in Tartus, a major coastal city, build a naval base. That's part of the reason that Russia has been so active even since the end of the Cold War. And certainly during the Putin era, they want to keep control of that major naval base in Tartus. The other thing about Hafez Assad's 30-year rule is that he dealt with any sort of opposition in a very, very harsh way. Just to give you a couple of examples, he didn't, to my knowledge at least, there may have been some coup d'etat attempts that were crushed and kept quiet, I don't know. But he faced a couple of uprisings, in particular in 1982 in the city of Hama, which is sort of right in the center of one of the main sort of population center here, Hama right there. There was an uprising in 1982 of the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's always this Islamic fundamentalist presence there. But Assad is very secularist, and he sees this, of course, and he sees it as it was, which was a major threat. And he crushed it brutally, violently. Estimates are that in about a 3-day uprising that was crushed by the Syrian army, about 2,000 people are killed, mostly on the Muslim Brotherhood side of that. And then they follow that up with arrests and further persecutions of anyone who might have been affiliated with it. So, long story short, Assad ruled with a very, very heavy hand. He also, not surprisingly, given that, of course, this is where he hailed from, he himself was Alawite, so he certainly preferenced the Alawite minority in his government. And this is the point at which, again, as I mentioned, the Alawites historically had been one of the economically more disadvantaged groups within Syrian society. That changes. That changes beginning in the 70s, in particular 80s and 90s during Assad's rule. He's favoring the Alawites for sure, and their economic, it's good to have people in high places, right? Their economic fortunes as a group, as a collective group, as a minority, but as a collective group, their economic fortunes certainly improved during this period of the Assad family, because it's not just him, as we'll see, dynasty. But he's also a smart politician, Assad, Gesundheit. He's also a smart politician, and he realizes that over favoring the Alawites, who are a small minority, at the expense of the rest of the population would not be a wise path to follow, and he does not do that. He certainly brings in elements of the Sunni majority in particular, and the key, I know I keep harping on this, but I do think it's very key, in particular in contrast with where we may be heading in the aftermath of this coup d'etat, is that he forges a broad coalition of secularists. As long as you were not an Islamic extremist, you could be part of and even benefit from being part of the Assad government in some capacity, be it as military or otherwise bureaucracy or otherwise. The key point being secularist, and that is a very, very key factor indeed. The elder Assad Hafez dies in 2000, and this is a family dynasty, so leadership passes to the younger of his two sons, which is this gentleman right here, Bashar al-Assad, who had not, by the way, been expected to assume that role. He had trained in London as an eye doctor, and his elder brother Basil was the heir apparent and was supposed to be the successor and had been trained and prepared for that role, but he died, I think, of cancer, but I'm not entirely sure about that, in, I think, 97, 98, kind of unexpectedly at a very young age. And so that left Bashar as the heir apparent, and he assumes power with his father's passing in 2000. And boy, it seemed like at the time, oh great, we're going to have some positive change. And indeed, those first, I'd say probably 7 to 8 months or so of the younger Bashar al-Assad's rule, they were referred to as the Damascus Spring. Referencing back, not the Arab Spring, by the way, which hasn't happened yet. And when it does happen a decade later, it's going to be to his misfortune, right? But when in this early period of his rule, of course, that references the Prague Spring, and the heart of Czechoslovakia, the heart of the Soviet East European Empire, when they tried to make these democratic reforms, right? It didn't work there, and it didn't work here either. Assad, he frees a lot of political prisoners that his father had imprisoned. He allows for the first time since probably Syrian independence, for non-governmental newspapers to be published and to have a voice. He allows. Again, he had studied in London, right? He'd been exposed to Western democracy, so he's willing, at least it seemed at first, to kind of give some leeway, allow for some element of dissidence and political opposition. But alas, it does not last. It lasts about 7-8 months. And then the Druze minority, it's only about 2 to 3% of the population, also considered a Shia sect, rose up in rebellion against Assad's government. They had long felt discriminated against by the Alawites, and so he crushes that uprising, and he falls sort of under the influence, if you will, of military establishment, sort of old order military establishment figures from his father's government, who are still in power, overlapping. And they convince him to basically revert back to a much more dictatorial style of rule, in which voices of dissidents are shut down immediately. He actually goes so far as to re-imprison some of the people he had let out of prison, some of the political prisoners. So this Damascus Spring, if we can even think about it in those terms, is very limited and doesn't last very long. And then, alas, he's going to really reach a key turning point that I'm sure you all remember very well indeed, and that is the Arab Spring that began in Tunisia in November of 2010. Again, I don't know how well people remember that event. It started with a fella in his early 30s, I think, in Tunisia, who set himself on fire, Mohammed Abazi, in Tunisia, to protest government pressures against economic pressures, really. This was the early stages of the Great Recession, I guess we're now calling it, right? And that had hit the area economically very hard. He was a fruit salesman, and government police, I should say, had raided his fruit stall and tried to force him to pay taxes and stuff, whatever taxes. So he responded to this by setting himself on fire in front of the main government buildings in Tunisia. And that, bad pun here, ignited, shall we say, the whole Arab Spring movement. And it spread from Tunisia to Libya, to Algeria, to Egypt, and alas, eventually to Syria. Much, by all accounts, much to Assad's surprise. He did not expect this challenge. And this is a challenge unlike any other challenge he had faced up until this point. This is 12 years into his rule, or 11 years into his rule. And it begins in, that is to say, the Arab Spring in Syria, which is going to spiral into the Civil War, begins in the southern city of Daraa, when a group of school children, interestingly enough, scribble anti-Assad graffiti on a wall outside of their school. And the authorities respond and react to this very harshly, which then sparks further protests, and it just kind of gradually spirals out of control. Protests erupted, really more so because of the reaction to what the school children had done, which is, by all accounts, was way over the top. When I say what now? Harshly, yes. How did they? The question being, how? And what do I mean by harshly? They didn't kill these kids. Right? I'm happy to say they did not round up and execute these kids, but they dealt with really their parents more so. They imprisoned some of their parents to kind of send a message. I think they expelled the kids from like school for a long period of time. So yeah, harshly, because one of those terms that can mean a lot of things. And really the protests that then erupt were in response to that, response to this response on the part of the Syrian government. And in one of those protests, the Syrian police opened fire, killing 4. And then that just, more often than not, what I've noticed in these police states, when they do kind of respond violent, bring out the riot police and respond violently, it does not work. It spirals out of control even more. And this is one of those examples. And within a very short period of time, this started at the February 2011 is when the school children wrote the anti-Assad graffiti, and really by June of that year, certainly, country's in the midst of a nasty civil war. So it spirals very quickly, and I don't think that was sort of the spark that set off the conflict, and clearly problems had been mounting for some time because of this Assad, not just the younger Assad, but at that point, 2011, the Assad family have been in control for 41 years. Right? So I think a lot of Syrians, and that was very much at the root of the Arab Spring across the board, aspiration for a more democratic form of rule. And certainly that applied in the case of Syria with a 41-year family dictatorship, right? So the civil war then begins. Early on, it did not go well at all for the Syrian government, and things, in fact, look like. I remember reading at the end of 2012, there were a lot of reports that Assad is going to be the next victim of the Arab Spring, because if you recall, of course, Algeria, Abu Hazi maintains his rule, Boutalezi, I should say, but in the case of Tunis, the dictator in Tunisia, where it started, the dictator Ben Ali is overthrown, and of course Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, remember? is overthrown. So the Arab Spring is toppling all these regimes, and it looked like Assad was going to be next. Part of that was because, which this map is a little later than that, but basically gets to the main point, 2013. This is sort of a breakdown, if you will, of, it says area of armed rebel activity is everything in the pink. Now that's bearing in mind that this is all a very sparsely inhabited area. That said, by the way, this is the early origins of ISIS. Remember ISIS? And ISIS had basically, with being ousted from Iraq, what becomes ISIS, it's still in a kind of a mutating form. ISIS actually originates in response to, as a result of, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in the Second Gulf War, 2003. And they eventually are ousted from Iraq, and they wind up ruling a pretty large swath of territory, mostly in Syria and Iraq. It's called ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, right? And a lot of that is in this desert area and in this border region with Iraq. So sparsely inhabited for sure, but you see a lot of areas of rebel activity. The blue dots on there are the Kurdish militias who basically control the mountainous territory up here. Then you see the Free Syrian Army. I'll talk more about them in a moment. In the red, they control certain areas, as you can see there. And then the black dots are areas that are still under Assad's government control. And they are minimal on this map. And Syria, Damascus, the capital, is controlled by Assad, but with a big red dot there. So it's contested, right? And we now know that Assad's strategy and why he gave way, especially in rural areas, he basically told his army, the Syrian government army, just abandon these outlying regions and concentrate your forces in the cities, in the major cities that we control, I should say, which is in that western, that center right in here. And so he kind of willingly gave up a lot of ground, in other words. And that's one reason that this was, you see such a divided map. But that led to a lot of conclusions at the time that turned out to be, well, I guess 12 years premature, that he was about to be overthrown. He wasn't at that time. He maintains control up until just this last year, of course. And what's more, he's able to gradually shift, that is Assad, gradually shift things back in his favor. And there's a couple of key developments in that respect. One is, again, the role of Russia, which is Tartus. Yeah, see Tartus right there? That's the site of the Russian naval base. And, Putin has aspirations of, once again, being like the old Soviet Union and having a major geopolitical role. And so he's getting involved here. Now, prior to Russia's decision, which is in 2013, they send massive arms shipments to Assad, to the Assad government. And one of the key points in that is it included anti-aircraft missiles. Why is that important? Because at the time, and this is of course the Obama administration and the UN were discussing the possibility of imposing a no-fly zone. Remember that in Iraq? They had 2 no-fly zones during the Hussein years in the 90s and early 2000s, which essentially meant you cannot fly the government, that is Hussein in the 90s in Iraq, could not fly government aircraft, warplanes into that territory. You could fly commercial aircraft, but not military. It was, the UN imposed these zones enforced by the U.S., basically to protect the Kurds in the northern part of Iraq and the Shia in the southern part of Iraq. So there was a lot of talk that, well, we need to impose a no-fly zone in this part, rebel-controlled, because Assad was sending out, remember he was using poison chemical warfare at one point, and he was sending his aircraft to bomb these rebel-controlled areas in the north. So they wanted to, well, when Russia sends the anti-aircraft missiles to Assad, that immediately put an end to any talk about a no-fly zone, because then one of your planes is shot down, and lo and behold, we've got potentially a nasty war on our side. The other key thing that turns the tide back in Assad. So Russia at that point in 2013 is just sending weapons. Also in 2013, Iran, a Shia power, right, that therefore backs Assad and backs the Alawite regime. They send weapons to Assad's government forces, and they also get their ally, the Hezbollah, in neighboring Lebanon to fight. Also Shia, I'll show a Shia group. This is a very complicated history. So Hezbollah fighters, some Iranian fighters, Iranian weapons for sure, and Russian weapons really turned the tide in Assad's favor 2013-ish. But then, even then, they regained some territory, but they kind of reach a stalemate. And then we get another key turning point in 2015 when the tide shifts more strongly in Assad's favor, because Putin, in September of 2015, Putin sends mostly air force, but also some ground troops, special forces, and some mercenary force. Remember that guy Yevgeny Prigozhin, who like back a year and a half ago in the summer, half-heartedly tried to overthrow Putin. Remember that? He was one of these leaders of one of these main mercenary groups that's sent to Syria. By the way, not long after that sort of half-hearted coup attempt, he died in a plane crash. No surprises there, right? But anyway, that was part of this, and special forces. Also, Iran now sent an influx of ground fighters to help Assad on troops on the ground. So this turns the tide definitely in Assad's favor in 2015. And boy, did it create a remarkably precarious situation, because the U.S. Air Force is there and involved and bombing, and the Russians are there and involved and bombing. And this map, this is from 2015. This again, the tail end of the Obama administration. What you see there with the red are all the Russian airstrikes, and what you see in the blue are the U.S. airstrikes. And what's going on here is Russia is supporting the Assad government of Syria, which means that they are bombing primarily, if you'll notice this cluster in here, they are primarily bombing a group known as the Free Syrian Army, which was the main group being supported by the United States. You mentioned all the different militia groups, right? By some estimates, when the Civil War begins, I've seen estimates that of all these armed militia groups, anywhere from 80 to 130. But it sort of comes down as, how do you define a militia group? What exactly is a militia group? A lot of these were just people in villages or neighborhoods that were like, we better get together and arm ourselves and have some at least minimal training to protect us from outsiders, right? So it was more like armed community watch groups. But there are a lot of definitely armed militia groups, and they basically break down into three main groups, one of which is the Free Syrian Army, which is the broadest group. This was led mostly by military figures who had defected from Assad's government, and they tended to be overwhelmingly secularist. So they're carrying on that sort of secularist tradition, but they're also very splintered. The Free Syrian Army was made up of a lot of these different groups and militias that have some sort of different agendas. They're not unified at all. But that's the group that the then Obama administration from the U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, right? Remember her? Right? They are supporting the Free Syrian Army, right? The other two main groups, well, one I already mentioned is ISIS, which is mostly in this sparsely inhabited desert territory. They are, of course, the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist Sunni group, right? Sunni Islam. But they were also pitted against the third main faction within this whole thing was al-Nusra, which was it seems strange to say, relatively moderate Islamic fundamentalist or extremist group, because they were affiliated with Al-Qaeda, right? But ISIS is much more radical than Al-Qaeda by this point in the political realm, oddly enough. So very complicated, and most of these groups, two of the three main groups are Sunni Muslim extremist groups. And then you have the Free Syrian Army. Well, the Russians intervene on behalf of the Assad government. That's, of course, the other major player, and it's Shia. And the Russians are bombing mostly the Free Syrian Army strongholds, but also ISIS. America, the U.S., is bombing mostly ISIS and to some extent also al-Nusra, but also the Assad government. So you have this, even through all the years of the Cold War, we never had anything like this, where both Russia and the United States are militarily active in the same country on different sides. I mean, that's a recipe for utter and complete disaster. There was one incident early on after Russia intervened. The U.S. had already been there. U.S. is using air power to mostly bomb ISIS, and they're relying on Kurdish ground troops to fight against ISIS. The Russians are using mostly air power and relying on Iranian and Hezbollah and these forces on behalf of Assad to mostly fight the Free Syrian Army supported by the United States. And there was a very scary incident in early 2016, not long after Russia had intervened, in which a U.S. warplane comes within a hair of colliding with a Russian warplane. Could have been a very, very, very horrible situation, to put it mildly. Fortunately, they didn't collide. They came close. And then after that, Russia and the U.S. agrees to share intelligence as to where they're going to be at any given time. So this was an ugly, ugly scenario. And the war then kind of reaches a new stalemate. The worst of the fighting during this period is 2012, 2017. And you might remember, of course, always caught in the crosshairs of these horrible conflicts, the common people, right? You might remember so many of them trying to flee the country to Europe. Like 2014, 2015 is when we really get a peak of people fleeing, trying to get to Europe. And it's because at that time the war was just horrible in Syria. And they're caught in the middle. But then it really kind of under control. They're still fighting, mind you, from 2017 to 2020. But by 2020, it looked like Assad had regained control of most, at least he had regained control of about 2/3 of the country and was reconsolidating power. But turns out a big problem is he didn't maintain control. He didn't reestablish control of the entire country. And that's eventually going to come back to get him, because this one of the northern areas is controlled by a Turkish-backed group, the Hayat Tahrir Sham, which, by the way, the U.S. State Department had listed in 2018 as a foreign terrorist organization. It's a coalition of at least 5 different Sunni extremist groups. And last November, they kind of regroup in this area that they control in the Idlib region in the north and go on an offensive. Completely unexpected. I don't think anybody saw this coming. They break the stalemate that had sort of been in place, and they very quickly make gains. They move in. They first take over the city of Aleppo there in the north in a very surprise attack, and then they just quickly, Assad's forces just kind of almost evaporate. Most observers agree that a key contributing factor to the subsequent fall of the Assad regime as he flees to Russia in December the 8th and the rebels take over as of that date. 2 key factors in that. One is that Russia, of course, which had buttressed the Assad regime, had really kind of diverted its attention and its resources, let's say, put it that way, to the war in Ukraine. And then vice versa, on the other side of that, Iran, which was the other main power broker here supporting Assad, had now diverted much of its attention and much of its resources to the war in Gaza. Right? So they weren't really paying attention, is what that boils down to, as much at least. And the opposition takes advantage of that, catch Assad by surprise, and lo and behold, it is Assad is done. I mean, I think he's done. I'm pretty sure he's done. He's in Moscow, and he still has supporters, definitely, who are now kind of fighting. And in fact, to end on that, and I'll be happy, of course, to take any questions you may have, but the new guy in town is this fella. That is, of course, Ahmed al-Sharaa, and he's an interesting character. I'm going to be very curious to see where this goes. He was, until quite recently, known as Muhammad al-Jalani, And that's an important little detail, by the way. That's his jihadist name, right? The name that you take on as a warrior. And in fact, it comes from Jalani in Arabic is the Golan region. His family, his father, had lived in the Golan Heights until they were kicked out by the Israelis with the occupation of the Golan Heights back in 1967 in the Six-Day War. So him taking that name is highly symbolic and very important, right? Al-Jalani. And he certainly has had, in terms of rhetoric, he has up until quite recently been very much an outspoken Islamic fundamentalist leader. He's changing his tune dramatically. He's changing his attire. Here we see him in a very this is a recent photo in a very Western shirt, right? Western suit. That was not the case up until quite recently when he was, public appearances. He was in the military fatigues or traditional Islamic dress, as the case may be. And he has, definitely been trying, I would say, to project an image of moderation and diplomacy in this new situation that he finds himself in, to make himself and his new regime more palatable, shall we say, to the West. And whether that works or not, I think he's, a bit of a tightrope here, balancing act. Because bottom line is, it was the Islamic extremist that managed his support from the Islamic extremists is what got him to this position in the first place. And now if he leans too heavily towards moderation, he's liable to lose their support. And we kind of see that playing out right now. He has been cautioning his support base, if you will, of Sunni extremists not to do exactly what they're doing. And I promise you I'm at the end here, which is earlier this month, and I don't know how much you guys have followed, but there's been another outbreak. It had been kind of stable there for a while, and I remember I was a little surprised because I thought for sure there's going to be retribution against the Alawite minority as Assad supporters. But it seemed maybe he was keeping that at bay and things were going to be quiet until really just literally the last few weeks. There have been major eruptions of violence. I don't know if folks have seen this in the news, and it has been targeted mainly at the Alawite community, including well-documented accounts of entire families, children and all, being rounded up and executed by some of these Sunni Muslim extremist groups who were part of the broad coalition that brought the current regime into power, but now are not listening to al-Sharia when he says, when he's preaching moderation. So I think there's a real balancing act. If he wants to stay in power internally, domestically, he's going to have to lean a little bit more to that extremist side, I'm afraid, I hate to say, as opposed to being a more of a sort of the face that he's trying to project internationally to the international community, which is a face of relative moderation. We'll have to just wait and see where it goes. Al-Sharia, by the way, has said that he plans to hold elections, but that he doesn't think the country will be in a position to do so for another 3 or 4 years at least. So I really don't know what to end this on except for a great deal of uncertainty. There's a whole lot it's a very precarious situation, to put it mildly. I like that al-Sharia is at least trying. The other side would be if he just came in and didn't even bother with trying to play a sort of a diplomatic tone here. At least he's realizes, I guess, that for the international community he needs to sing a certain tune of tolerance and for all. But I'm still very weary as to where either it's going back to a more full-fledged civil war, which in the last couple of weeks points in that direction, or it perhaps points to a stronger just crackdown on his behalf. And this time, instead of this Alawite Shia being in control, they're going to be the victims. They're going to be the primary victims, and Sunni extremists are going to be in control. So I guess we'll just have to watch the news and see what happens. Thank you all very much, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Jeff, that was terrific. Thank you. Speaking of the news, I read just 2 or 3 days ago that Hezbollah had come across the border from Lebanon
Yeah.
and killed something like 8 Syrians. What do you think that's about?
That is, if it's Hezbollah, then I hadn't read that specific piece, although I can't say that I'm the least bit surprised. I'm sure Hezbollah is targeting the Sunni extremists. They're on the Assad Shia side. I mean, this breaks down, and indeed the major breakdown in the Middle East now for some time has been Sunni Shia. That is the single most important divide, and we see it expressed in several places, including Yemen, here certainly in Syria. Really where this tide turned is with the Second Gulf War and the U.S. intervention in Iraq. Iraq is a majority Shia country. About 65% of the population of Iraq is Shia, but it had been ruled historically all the way back to the Ottoman Empire period. What was Iraq, even though Iraq as such didn't exist, the provinces that became Iraq, let me put it that way, were ruled by the Sunni minority, always. And that is true right up until 2003, when the U.S. intervened, overthrew Saddam Hussein, and since then, I mean, frankly, the big winner, if you can even speak in those terms, the winner of the Second Gulf War was Iran. Because since the end of the Second Gulf War, Iraq is a majority Shia, and it is a Shia-controlled regime, and it has essentially been an Iranian client state. So Iran gained, thanks to the United States primarily, a major new ally in this Shia-Sunni breakdown in the Middle East. And the Hezbollah, which has long been, I mean, their origins actually trace back, they are originated in response to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And Hezbollah is a Shia minority group that, of course, has been on Assad's side in this conflict. So if they're involved in that, that's the scary part, that I'm afraid the civil war might yet keep going. Because if you have these armed Shia groups like Hezbollah coming over from Lebanon on behalf of the Alawites and Assad, you know, it could just be a reignited civil war that we're looking at.
I see we have a question over there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
You didn't say a great deal about what the U.S. might do in the future to influence things there. It seems to me, I'm naive as I am, that this is an opportunity to exercise soft power to influence things. Yeah. But the U.S. has recently destroyed much of its capability to exercise soft power by the
USAID.
elimination of USAID, which could have worked with government, with civil society, offering help with education, health, and governance. And so what do you think we could do now?
Well, you know, with this administration, I'm going to be quite honest, I don't know what to expect in any realm, and including especially foreign policy. To my knowledge, Trump has not made any statements about the situation in Syria. I'm sure they're watching it very closely. Somebody's watching it very closely. But you're absolutely correct. I think we're kind of shooting ourselves, quote unquote, in the proverbial foot by completely eliminating USAID or greatly diminishing USAID, which is exactly this soft power, a term, you know, for ways that the U.S. through aid and education programs and things like that have tried to influence other peoples of the world, you know, really the entire world to varying degrees, and especially here. I think, in fact, I'll go even further. I think that's exactly why Shara, the new leader of Syria, is playing this sort of diplomatic tone, if you will, because he wants and expects that sort of aid from the West. And it looks like he's not going to get it from the U.S., and if anything, that's a factor that will push him, and I suspect it's going in this direction, quite frankly. I think that, along with other factors, are going to increasingly push him in a more extremist role, if you will, which is where he was until quite recently anyway, you know? And so now, if he's not going to be able to get any benefits from a U.S. alliance, and I don't think he will, or soft power, you know, I see him tending more and more to that extremist element within his own group, within his own power base.
With regard to USAID, it is my understanding that we might call their legitimate activities are going to be transferred to the State Department.
Yeah.
And so there's not necessarily any diminishment of the
Well,
so-called
let's
soft
hope
power.
not. Yeah, and I will preface by saying I should emphasize this. USAID has a. I don't know what you mean by legitimate activities. They have a terrible track record of less than legitimate activities in a lot of cases that involved not so much, I don't know, soft power skewed with an element of underlying, what's the word, trickery, or trying to sway things in the U.S. interest that were not necessarily in the interest of local peoples. This time I definitely see your hand.
All right, talking about the United States involvement in this area, as we recall in the Obama administration, he gave a lot of money to Iran, did all stuff, and sort of Biden's administration did the same thing and gave him money. So is that sort of an indication that the United States at that particular time was pro-Iranian, and now we're going to have to cut that off, or what's the situation?
Good question, good question. That was such a complicated situation with Iran at the end of the Obama administration in particular. You may recall, of course, they signed a pact. It wasn't just the United States. It involved China, France, UK. I feel like somebody else, maybe Russia. Russia was involved in that, right? And the Iranians agreed to allow international inspectors to come in to inspect nuclear sites to make sure they're not building up their nuclear arsenal. And part of the exchange for that, the reason, and this was, I think, grossly distorted in a lot of the U.S. media, that the U.S. side, the Obama administration, agreed to basically return to Iran monies that it owed to Iran, going all the way back to the late 70s, during the end of the Shah regime, and of course the 1979 revolution, and of course you all remember the hostage crisis. I love talking to groups of people who remember the history. My undergrads do not remember, needless to say. But a huge part of that agreement was that the U.S. would return to Iran frozen assets that the U.S. the Carter administration had frozen back in '79 in response to the hostage crisis, and included in that was a huge payment, a repayment, I guess I should say. The Shah had ordered weapons in '78, a huge weapons shipment, mostly planes, in '78 that was, in the many millions. And then, of course, the revolution happened. He was overthrown, and the U.S. got the money, but never produced the weapons because of that transition. So a large part of that money that went to Iran was money that we frankly owed to them. And it wasn't a lot was made out of this in the media at the time. Yes, they did send it over in cash, the Obama administration, in crates full of cash. But that's why that was at the request of the Iranians, because over the years their reserves, their hard currency reserves, had been grossly depleted, and their banking system was on the brink of collapse. So they requested, and that was just the first of what were supposed to be several payments in cash based on that agreement, which frankly I thought was a good thing. I'll be honest, I thought that deal with Iran was a very good deal on many levels. In part just kind of, let's be friends instead of enemies. I don't think Iran poses any sort of threat to us, and I think their willingness to open up to inspections, weapons inspections, was a clear sign that they're developing nuclear energy for sure, but I don't think they pose a threat militarily. Now that has changed. I would say now they pose more of a threat, in part in reaction to that, because when the Trump administration took over, one of the first things, of course, you'll remember that they did was to end that agreement with Iran. And then they have, sort of been one of the reactions on the Iranian side for that was their next presidential elections is they elected a very hardline president who his rhetoric has been anti-U.S., anti-Western. So it's tit for tat on both sides. And unfortunately, I would say it's gone the wrong direction. Iran put some stipulations on the inspections, without a doubt. The gist, if I can, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, being that, yes, there were a lot of stipulations on the Iranian side about the process of inspections. Some of that, I have to throw in, stemmed from the experience of Iraq in the 90s. There was a very infamous incident in the late 90s. This was, of course, the Bill Clinton administration, right? Where Iran had also, well, they hadn't necessarily agreed. They had been, at the end of the first Gulf War, Iran had been forced to accept weapons inspections. Remember that? And then a large part of the lead up to the second Gulf War was their alleged non-cooperation, which was true. But Iraq said, this was 90, this actually, Bill Clinton administration bombed Iraq literally on the day of his impeachment hearing. Remember that? And it was in response to what he said was Iraqi non-cooperation with the inspections team. The Iraqis said, well, yeah, we're not cooperating because the U.S. has broken the agreement because they have included spies, basically, intelligence agents in the inspection team, and part of the agreement was that that would not be the case. The Clinton administration said, no, we're not doing that. That's not true. Shortly thereafter, a Lebanese newspaper revealed that, in fact, yes, there were U.S. spies as part of the inspection team that had infiltrated the inspection team. Clinton administration actually had to say mea culpa and admit that, yeah, sorry, I guess we did do that after all. And looking back at that, you're absolutely correct. Iran, looking back at that experience, did include a whole lot of, stipulations and provisions for how this inspection team, including the 30-day, allowance and whatnot. So that's true, but it's also historically rooted, without a doubt, as to why they were making those stipulations.
Jeff, we have a very patient questioner.
Okay, I'm sorry, yeah.
Coming to more recent times, you mentioned Hezbollah going in and fighting and adding to the mix of confusion and instability in Syria.
Yes.
I wonder about that because I thought that Hezbollah had been pretty much beaten down in Lebanon with the Israeli strike, and they've backed off from being disruptive in Lebanon. So is it because of that agreement they want to fight, so they're going into Syria?
You mean now, right? Because, of course,
Now.
Yeah, the Hezbollah involvement in the 20-teens predated the current conflict in which they have been strongly attacked. You're right. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they've been worn down or they're not out of the picture by any means, nor is Hamas, for that matter, right? Despite the fact that Netanyahu's main goal, he said, for this military mission was the elimination of Hamas. That definitely has not happened. Hamas is alive and well, I'm afraid, and so is Hezbollah, maybe to a lesser degree. I mean, he did make some major strikes against Hezbollah for sure, but they're still there. They're still a presence. They're in fact part of they're not just a military sort of armed militia, but they're a political party, and as such part of the Lebanese government also. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I hadn't heard the report that Bob mentioned about some of the Hezbollah fighters crossing in the current scenario the border, but I'm not surprised, and I would say that perhaps that is at least partly in response to what they faced during this Israeli airstrikes here, about this time last year, actually it was the fall of last year. So that makes sense, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is a bit late to ask this question, but could you go over the origins and the present history of Shia versus Sunni?
Can't hear you.
The question, I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, is the differences between Sunni and Shia? Yeah, the Sunni Shia, boy, that's a whole nother day. Because obviously that's a complicated one. I'll give you the abbreviated brief version, which is it all stems, the differences and the conflict between Sunni and Shia stem from the very early history of Islam in the 7th century, really immediately after the death, over decades after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. And the root of the issue was, the root of the problems that eventually becomes the Shia-Sunni divide was over the question of who should be his rightful heir or successor or caliph, as they call it. And there were two or three different kind of competing schools within the Islamic leadership at that time. The one that becomes the Shia minority, and in fact, the full title of the Shia minority is the Shia Alat Ali, which is the party of Ali. Ali was one of the early key Muslim figures on the younger side, who was the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. And that sect wanted him to be the next successor, the next caliph or ruler of the Islamic realm because of the traditional Arab practice of bloodline succession. Muhammad did not have any sons who lived to adulthood. He had daughters, but not sons. So he didn't have a son that could succeed him. Ali was the closest bloodline relative. So the Shia pushed for him to be the successor. That did not happen, however. Right? The successor becomes Abu Bakr, who was not in any way related to Muhammad and was part of a different kind of group, really one of the elder group, if you will, of Islamic leaders around Muhammad, who died shortly after, actually, and was replaced. The first three caliphs were sort of that realm, and then Ali becomes the fourth caliph, but he's assassinated. And long story short, the roots of the Sunni Shia divide go back to that succession issue, and especially the assassination of Ali. The Shia claim, of course they obviously recognize and revere the Prophet Muhammad, but they do not recognize the first three caliphs, who they see as usurpers. They believe it should have been Ali all along. He was assassinated by political enemies, which they, of course, reject. And by the end of the 7th century, you have a full-blown division between these two sects. The vast majority at the time, and really historically, about 80% of the Islamic world are Sunni Muslims. The vast majority. The other thing I'll say to that point is they have mostly, overwhelmingly coexisted peacefully, Sunni and Shia. There have been moments of outbreak of violence between them, for sure, at various times, but the current situation and the current breakdown of Sunni Shia dates back to 2003 and the U.S. Second Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq. That's when it comes to the forefront, because of a key leader on the Sunni side who founded what becomes ISIS. And he argues he argues against the Shia and for violence against the Shia, and that becomes a sectarian conflict. So they've lived mostly peacefully coexisted. There are spates of violence every so often, but it's the last 20 years now have gotten a lot worse between Sunni Shia, and that is definitely a direct consequence and legacy of the U.S. invasion, the Second Gulf War.
Jeff, we have a question here, and I think we'll make it the last one. We've
Okay.
given you a pretty good workout.
Thank you for your talk. I do have a question. You
Sure.
implied illegitimate acts of USAID. Where would I read about those?
Oh, golly, where would you read about those? I can give you some specific examples. As far as reading, I guess it's just sort of, I don't know if there's I can't think of a specific book. I think one of the most, I just finished a book on the Soviet-Afghan War, and this dates back to actually also the Obama years, 2009-ish, I think. There was a rather infamous incident where the USAID and WHO, and there were other institutions involved in this, they were on the brink, they were this close to eliminating polio. Remember that? My father had polio, so I was really hoping to see that happen, right? But then it didn't happen in Afghanistan, which was under, this was earlier than 2009, I'm sorry. This goes back to the Taliban's first rule. It was the late, it was the Obama administration. I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself here. It was the late 2000s. The Taliban was not in control of the country, but they were in control of large areas of Afghanistan. And it's very similar to the situation I mentioned with the weapons inspections with Iraq. These teams were not supposed to involve any sort of intelligence agents at all. This was a USAID soft power practice, right, as you can understand. And they had all but eliminated polio just about everywhere in the world, except some of these regions of Afghanistan. The Taliban refused to allow them in because they claimed that there were U.S. intelligence agencies there as part of it. The Obama administration said, no, that's not true. It turns out it was. And so once again, soft power, I would say illegitimate use of USAID. I had friends when I've traveled in Russia and elsewhere. I've met many people from around the world. They refer to it as the US CIA. I think they put a D on the end of that. I mean, and I don't want to give too much of a broad. It's not all negative, right? right. It's not all negative. And they've done a lot of very positive things, for sure. And I do think the gentleman's there. I do think cutting it out completely is a net loss in the long term because some of that soft power has been beneficial.
Jeff, thank you very much. You've hit a
Thank y'all.
home
I
run.
appreciate it.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.